I am really thrilled to be here. This is such an extraordinary group of thinkers and writers and scholars who you're going to have a chance to hear from in just a moment. So I want to get the program off right away. I also want to thank the Charlotte Observer for generously hosting this, one of the nation's great newspapers. And I will also say that I did spend some of my growing up years in the South. I went to a college here in the South, and so I really do have a long time special interest in this part of the country. And I've long been aware of how I think it is not really a part of the country that's not really well understood. So I'm particularly, it is so often caricatured, it is so often mythified. So I think my goal this morning is to bring some clarity to that, and this is the perfect group of folks to do that. So let's plunge in, and we're gonna talk for a little while, and then we are gonna open it up to all of you for questions and comments. The only journalist out there I may not call on is my husband, Al Hunt, who's right here, the guy with the white hair. He's executive editor for Bloomberg News in Washington, and I have to decide whether or not I'm going to let him ask a question. In any event, Hodding Carter, let's start with you. You've done it all. You've done newspapering. You've been in government. You were the State Department spokesman during the Carter administration. You come from a great newspaper family in the state of Mississippi, where you stood for the New South. You were leaders in repositioning the Democratic Party. Give us, from your perspective, where do you see the party and its position in 2012?
The party and its position in 2012.
And let's make sure your mic is working so everybody can hear you. And
Is it working?
Apologize. I think I'm blocking everybody's view over here, so I may step back.
Let me begin by saying that each of us were told that we had 3 minutes, proportionate to each of our predecessors having 10 minutes each. As I do the math, that means I have 15 minutes, given the amount of time each of them took for their 10 minutes. I will not use that 15 minutes because I'm neither a scholar nor, in fact, a person who has studied the figures very much. This is going to be impressionistic, so you can put down your pens. In 1928, my grandfather came back from voting in the presidential election and announced to his sons actual shock and surprise that he couldn't help himself. He had pulled the eagle after all. He had voted Democratic. Why was that a surprise? Because the Democratic Party had begun the process of deserting the South's instincts for a more national constituency and had nominated a Catholic, an impossible thing for the very Protestant ethos and ethic and politics represented by some of these charts. But he voted nonetheless, a man of rigorous prejudice when it came to race and religion, nonetheless voted Democratic. They, of course, stayed Democratic in 32. They were not offered any reason not to, since the way Roosevelt ran was intensely conservative. They stayed in 36 because they weren't sure the farms had been saved quite there. And thereafter, began a long, slow unraveling of a passionate love affair and marriage, which was completed, as was said by 2 of our predecessor speakers, by 1980. But the divorce didn't just happen like that. It was a response to any number of changes, not in the South, but in the rest of the country and in the Democratic Party specifically. So that at each stage of the divorce proceedings, what you had first was what seemed to be, to an unchanging South, a deliberate affront to fateful love and regard. And so in 1948, the Democrats come forward with a civil rights plank, which Mr. Truman was passionately interested in, much to the shock of his many supporters who had gone with him for vice president precisely because he was no liberal. And then suddenly it turns out that he is. And we have the Dixiecrat walkout and the Dixiecrat party and a brand new reflection of disaffection in the South. We also have, in that 48 walkout, what becomes the predicate for something else, which is the growing Republican interest in the South, but a different kind of interest. So my dad in 1952 goes with Eisenhower He goes with Eisenhower because Eisenhower represents the New South, an urban, moderate, conservative South, which will break the iron grip of the one-party system. And a lot of people were Republicans at that time, not a lot, but certain types in the metropolitan South and the growth South were there. Of course, Eisenhower does relatively well, and in any case establishes in the Eisenhower years that it is possible for these swing states of growth that Ferrel loves to point out could be Republican. And so all of a sudden, you keep looking at these sudden blips on the chart in which a Virginia or a Florida votes for Republicans. They are, of course, being cultivated in a way that the Republicans had never bothered with in the past, in the post-Civil War era. The old Dixiecrat crowd, however, is not the Eisenhower crowd. But the Democratic Party gives a great gift to the Republicans in both the election of the Catholic, who our governor here was one of the few major Democrats in the South to endorse in the 1960 election. You elect a Catholic, which is, again, a direct repudiation of what much of the white Protestant South wants. And then the Catholic, despite himself, and I mean it, despite himself, suddenly finds himself endorsing civil rights measures which are anathema to much of the South. And with his assassination and the accession of the Democrat from Texas, a man of great ambition, Mr. Johnson, the passage of a succession of civil rights acts, each one of which, whether it was housing, voting, public accommodations, what have you, says to the South, we just want to put your face in it. When I say the white South, what the rest of the Democratic Party is saying to them. Nixon comes along, and there's much conversation about the Southern strategy, but by that time, you didn't need to be very smart to know that the South was in an uproar. There was George Wallace, who had by that time run a couple of times the presidency, and was discovering that not merely Southerners, but lots of others in the country were unamused by certain of the changes in the Democratic Party. I want to emphasize this over and over again. The Democratic Party is changing dramatically. The South is not at that point. So along comes the period of this slowly building death, not merely of a marriage, but of another set of relationships. And so you have now another famous moment. Nixon wins. He's not hurt by the fact that there's another candidate in there, but the fact is the Democrat has no possibility of carrying anything in the South and doesn't. A strange thing happens, of course. The Democratic Party gets even more to the left as far as the rest of the country is concerned, and along comes the McGovern election. I remember it well because I was traveling with something called the Grasshopper Special, which was aping Liz Carpenter's Ladybird Special from the '64 election. This is a bunch of campers. Now, we were really serious about carrying the South. There wasn't anybody to the left, to the right of me, and any of those campers who went across the South. And we spoke at the North Carolina State Fair. And so help me, that wonderful, silly man, Nick Galifianakis, came and spoke with us, thereby guaranteeing that Jesse Helms had a sitting target. He was one of two incumbent Democrats in the South who came out to meet us. All else had enough sense to go hide because they knew at this point the party was dead in the water, as did a lot of us who were in the South. The other person who came out to see us, incidentally, was Jimmy Carter, who came out of the front door of the Capitol in Atlanta and greeted us, and I thought, what is this idiot doing? I mean, he cannot be serious. All right, so 72. A lot of us are looking around and saying prior to 72, the only way the Democrats can win is to find a Southerner. And of course, a lot of us thought we had found one, and that was in Terry. And that was a dry stream, as you all remember. It was a dry stream I had a lot of fun at least saying something about because I nominated him after he was dead at that Democratic convention and was glad I did and happy that we had the chance to do it. But he led the way to Jimmy Carter, which incidentally, Jimmy being no fool, had come out knowing the Democrats would remember he stood with the party in an impossible place. Jimmy actually carries much of the South. And if you took out the third party, he would have carried a couple more states that he lost in that particular election. That's it. That's it for the Democrats. That's it. The two glamour boys of Baptist white Southern politics, Bill Clinton and Al Gore, cannot carry the South and do not. Do not go look for the states they carried. You will not find many, depending on the election. But you see, the reason the National Party had been walking its own walk was best personified by the fact that in the Gore election, he didn't need Florida. All he had to do was carry New Hampshire, and he would have carried it without a single southern state. By that moment, the reversal was total in American politics. A Democratic Party which had to have the solid South to do anything, and a Republican Party which used to win without it, now is a Republican Party which has to have near a solid South, and a Democratic Party that doesn't have to have it to win in the national election. This is a fundamental change in the politics of America, and certainly in the South. If you're a Democrat like me in the Deep South, of course, it means you're in a wilderness you don't see ever getting out of, and every now and then I look up at my dad in heaven and I say, Dad, is this enough of a two-party system for you? I mean, this is now gotten completely gone. Ferrel's extraordinarily good piece of work in talking about the now possibility of a new marriage is built entirely on something which is the final point I want to make. The South of that marriage has now begun the same fundamental change that the North of the old marriage underwent for some time, in which it wrote off essentially the South. This new South of the emerging South, the economically vital new South, is a South which, unlike the Souths of the preceding 350 years, is not static in its population base. Not the same black and white folk who've been looking at each other for 300 years, but has vast streams of people who are no longer tied by history or by precedent or by their own habits to the past. Whether they are Yankees coming in, whether Hispanics coming in, black folks coming back, you name it. It's a different place entirely. We are practically American now in the way that we have coming out of being frozen in our population and have become dynamic in the size of our, the way our population works. My granddad does literally turn over in his grave all the time. He could not pull the eagle today. They don't pull eagles anymore in Louisiana. But a lot of folks who are now Southerners can, in fact, come to grips with the New South. And believe me, because nobody is willing to talk honestly about race, it needs to be said at least occasionally that it wasn't a small thing that 3 Southern states voted for Obama. It was a revolutionary, incredible thing that 3 Southern states voted for Obama, almost as revolutionary as a nation which had never been able to find it in itself to actually think that ahead of the line was a black candidate, voted for a black presidential candidate. We are simply no longer the place that engaged in the early marriage, the long romance, but that's true nationally as well as South. I have no idea, and I don't think many people do, what happens in the long term. In the short term, it is still the Republicans to lose on a basic kind of way because the changes have not yet become magnified. Elsewhere around this campus, this place, they're going to be having these sessions on the Blue South. A lot of folks who have great hope that there's some way to recreate a democratic approach which will not offend so many white Southerners. They're my friends. I wish them luck. I do not see how it works, frankly, but I hope it can without doing violence to the new party. Sorry, I didn't actually go 20 minutes, but I tried.
Hodding Carter, thank you very much for that terrific political look at the South. Sitting next to Hodding is Peter Coclanis. He is a historian. Peter, you have focused on the economic health of this region. So talk about how the global marketplace has changed the way of life here, how it's changed this place.
Well, thank you, Judy. It's always hard to follow Carter. I mean, Hodding, I've done this a number of times, and it's a thankless task. So I'll just be myself and try to talk a little bit about the way in which the South has been transformed. And as you'll see, I'm a bit more pessimistic about the South than some of the other speakers today, except maybe Gene. Gene might be as pessimistic as I am about the future going forward. I'm an economic historian. Some of you might be wondering what an economic historian is. It's once been defined by Lloyd Dobbins, actually, one of your own, as a person who loves numbers but lacks sufficient charm, grace, or wit to become an accountant. And so I think that's me. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about some of the forces that have created the South about which I'm so pessimistic. A few bullet points. One, I think that the forces that created the Sun Belt South between 1945 and 1950 and the early 80s have been largely spent. I think the key to the Sun Belt South during that period, considered as a whole, was the removal of a huge number of workers out of a very backward, dreadfully inefficient, low-skill, undercapitalized agricultural sector and into other sectors, particularly where their unskilled labor could be employed more efficiently. Now, what were these sectors? For the most part, low-skill, low-value-added manufacturing industries, particularly those of an assembly or basic processing nature rather than metal fabricating and things like that. Now, while such industries, textile, apparel, light industry of one type or another, aren't great, by adding capital to human labor, they really significantly increased productivity, which allowed for rising wages, rising income, and rising living standards for more and more of the South's population. In this, the region was following, if only implicitly, a tried and true, time-tested development strategy that most other parts of the developed world had experienced once they developed, basically a move out of agriculture into light industry. By the 80s, this strategy began to play itself out. And I think as technological change rendered labor requirements in Southern manufacturing reduced, and jobs were increasingly lost to other lower-cost parts of the world due to globalization, the Sun Belt's convergence upon national economic norms really slowed, and before it came to a stop completely in the early 90s, as Ferrel pointed out in one of his slides. Southern per capita income has not converged at all upon national norms since the early 90s. It's about 91% of the nation as a whole. Median household income in North Carolina over the last few years has actually fallen. It's about $43,000 a year, putting us 40th in the nation as a whole. Now, even before the end of the so-called convergence, the lead story that we often saw about the South, the rise of the so-called Sun Belt, was, in my view, quite misleading or at least incomplete. As MDC, the policy think tank that Ferrel talked about earlier, put it in a seminal report in 1986, there were always, and even then, shadows in the Sun Belt, particularly in rural and non-metropolitan parts of the region. And with the decline of light industry, and often the collapse completely of light industry in these areas, as it accelerated in the 90s and in the first decade of the 21st century, many of these areas have essentially become economic basket cases, forlorn, if not hopeless places, in my view, beset by every imaginable social pathology, places where the best economic development strategy is often, as an economist friend of mine put it, a ham sandwich and a one-way bus ticket out. Now, to be sure, the trajectory of better situated parts of the region, the metro areas that Ferrel talked about, particularly financial centers such as Charlotte, or IT hubs such as RTP, places where the creative class lives, tourist areas, affluent retirement communities, energy-rich areas, and areas around military bases or universities, government centers, and the like, have done better, increasingly pulling away from the rural and non-metropolitan parts of the South. In many ways, what we're seeing in the South looks like what many development economists looking at the rest of the world call, in my view, a middle-income trap. similar to places like Thailand and Malaysia today, and earlier Argentina and Brazil, where an economy stagnate after reaching a certain middle level, usually because their manufacturing and labor cost structures no longer allow them to compete with lower cost areas, but the labor forces aren't skilled enough to compete higher up the value chain. In an international context, the motto of the Southern labor force today is, I'm pretty expensive and I'm not very skilled. And that's one of the problems we have to deal with. Last week there was an article in the New York Times, some of you may have seen, on the Bangladeshi textile workforce. It was quite interesting. And in the course of the article, it pointed out that minimum wage for Bangladeshi textile workers is $37 a month. They work a minimum of 200 hours a month, so that comes out, doing the math, 18.5 cents an hour. These workers have basically the same equipment as our basically apparel workers have in the South, which is one major reason why in Bangladesh, Bangladesh is the leading supplier in the world of Tommy Hilfiger, The Gap, Calvin Klein, H&M, et cetera, et cetera. With these points in mind, it shouldn't really surprise us, in my view, that the South in general, and North Carolina in particular, have been hit extremely hard by the recession of 2007 and 8. In the case of North Carolina, the state today has an unemployment rate of about 9.6%, considerably higher than the 8.3 in the U.S. as a whole. And it's the 5th highest in the entire United States. My institute just put out a recent study in your thumb drive, and you'll see that every part of the state, every income group, every job classification, every age, and every age category has been hit hard by this recession. The structural factors that I've just alluded to, combined with the problems of Charlotte's financial sector, what happened with Wachovia and Wells Fargo and BOA, the collapse of the construction industry in the state, which has been profound over the last few years, and ironically, continuing robust in-migration have all meant that the labor market in North Carolina has been tremendously stressed over the last few years, especially since it never really recovered from the 2000-2001 recession. The most stunning finding in this study, really, that we just completed is that since 2000, North Carolina has added about 0.3% jobs, while the state as a whole has gained almost 20% in population. This is the economic backdrop of the South and North Carolina for the fall elections, in my view. One way or another, I think, if the South is going to emerge economically out of this age of rapid technological change and globalization, Southern workers have to become more skilled. And whether or not there's the political will to bring this about is a key question. We just put out a report in which we entitled it Moving Beyond Plato versus Plumbing. And I think what we have to do in the South is develop multiple pathways to ensure post-secondary education for all North Carolinians and Southerners so that we could move up the value chain and create a future economically for this fast-growing part of the United States. Thank you.
It's an intriguing idea, ensuring post-secondary education. So you can see what a rich collection of ideas we're having thrown out here, and we wish we had hours and hours to talk, but I see the clock ticking. It's already 1:15. Kareem Crayton, I'm going to turn to you next. Law professor, you have focused, among other things, on voting rights. I want you to give us some insight into all this emphasis that we're seeing in the news on the new voting rights laws that have come up in a number of states. How are these voter ID requirements going to affect this campaign, and are these laws going to have a bigger effect in the South? We know they hit Pennsylvania, Ohio, as well as Florida and some other parts of the South, but give us a sense of the South in particular.
Sure. Thank you, Judy. And let me just say, since I also am a native Southerner like Hodding, although I have not been a native Southerner as long as Hodding has, I won't have as much to say. But he has far more to say, so I will keep my comments short. Let me try to respond to your question by emphasizing a couple of things that add to some of the wonderful background that I think that all the speakers have offered. I think in general, North Carolina has, I think, a particular place even among southern states. Hodding mentioned earlier that it is something that 3 southern states voted for the president. I think it's also important to see the very important distinctions that are here in North Carolina, politically speaking, that separate it from even other southern states, even those in the peripheral South. We've heard a lot about the presence of the commercial and banking interests here, which are definitely not present in a large part of the South, and the fact that there is a cosmopolitan population of folks coming in and out. But 2 important points that get to the question that I think is an important one that Judy asked are, one, that there is actually serious party contestation in this state. Notwithstanding, I think Hodding's correct point that Republicans have had a foothold in this region, North Carolina hasn't really fit that trend as easily as I think a lot of other states, like the state I'm from, Alabama. This is the one state where you have 12 years of, at least so far, uninterrupted Democratic control of the governor's seat. You're not going to find another state where that's true. There is also, of course, in this state, at least until 2010, Democratic control of the state legislature. Again, not something that you can say in a bunch of other southern states. Last point, and this is going to get to the question about voting rights, there actually is a very significant presence of racial coalition building here. We talk about Barack Obama putting a coalition together. That's been true in North Carolina for some time among folks, both black and white, who compete certainly on the Democratic side. So case in point, in the last, and actually in the current state legislature, there are, I think, about 7 African Americans in the state Senate. None of them represent majority African American constituencies. You're not going to see that in most other southern states, certainly not that strong a pattern. However, it's important because that is a trend that is likely to be changed, and it is likely to be changed because of party competition. We just finished a round of redistricting that was controlled by the Republican Party, and their goal is, I think, to go back to the Pew Center to make the Republican Party a solidly white, largely white party, but certainly to leave the largest constituency among the Democratic voters to be African Americans. And we know that the differences numerically between African Americans and whites, if we make this a racially divided election, always means that the Democratic Party will lose. That's what's at issue. And they managed to do it this time using the division of district lines. Now, ironically, and I'll just say this, it is because, according to them, they think that federal law requires them to do so. Now, you're not going to hear many instances where you hear the Republican Party talk about the importance of following the federal mandates, but this is one of them. And of course, part of that is due to their intent to compete. But I think those sorts of fights are really about the party competition and their effort to make a lasting impression on the politics of the South. So redistricting is one area where voting rights is going to be very, I think, important. Yes, the district drawing has ended, but the court litigation has just commenced. So that's going to be one, I think, important question that comes up in the courts in the next year. Most of the fighting will be done after the election, but it's going to become relevant. 2 other issues that are going to be relevant to the upcoming election involves voter ID laws. Republicans have also taken basically a template that was devised in conservative think tanks and taken it around to a large number of states to be adopted in the present election, so that you can only cast a ballot if you present photo ID of a certain type issued by a government to indicate you are who you say you are. Now, it turns out that most of the folks who don't have access to the photo ID, who currently don't have things like a driver's license, include the poor, the elderly, and in many cases, non-white citizens. It's likely to have a huge effect on a lot of states where, particularly in metropolitan areas, getting access to the voter ID is not an easy thing to do, in many cases where you have to pay for it. There's litigation going on around that. In many cases, it's not quite clear whether or not that is going to be in place for the upcoming election. One reason that's not likely to be as significant in the South as it is elsewhere is because of the application of the Voting Rights Act. Most of you all have probably noticed that the district court in Washington, D.C. invalidated the enactment of a statute in Texas that tried to do this on the grounds that Texas could not show that the effect would not be discriminating against the poor and non-white citizens. That's not a law that applies in places like Pennsylvania, where there's no sort of we call it pre-clearance, no early effort to determine whether or not the law is likely to create discriminatory impact. So in the South, South Carolina is another state that's next in line to have this kind of review process. That kind of protection is an important one for those who believe that this law is likely to have a negative impact. Final thing to mention is early voting. In a large number of the southern states, the Democratic Party used early voting quite effectively to get African Americans in particular out to vote. They utilized Sunday morning voting after church, getting a large number of people to the polling places. That is not going to be as widely available as it was before. In a number of states, arguably because of economic tightening, belt tightening, the legislatures have decided to curb that somewhat, and to some extent they've been successful. That is likely to have some impact on the extent to which Democrats can lock in a number of votes fairly early. It's not to say that Republicans don't use it too, but again, the game is going to fundamentally change, to use a phrase, because of this policy. Last thing to mention, all of these laws, as I've made clear, are all being sort of seen through the lens of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which Ferrel Guillory mentioned earlier. The important piece that is sort of looming over all of this discussion is the Voting Rights Act itself is under assault and will likely be challenged in the United States Supreme Court, if not before the election, shortly afterwards. And so I think much of the conversation about whether or not these laws have discriminatory impact are had in light of some concern that at some point or another, this protection might be invalidated by the Supreme Court.
Again, raising all sorts of questions I'm sure that folks have, and hopefully we'll have some time to get into some of that. Next is Jacquelyn Hall. Jacquelyn, you wear two hats. One is as a history professor, the other is as the founder of the Southern Oral History Project. That means you're talking to people across the South. You're hearing from the grassroots. So my question is there a profound change in the way people live and the way they work in the South today? We've been talking about laws, we've been talking about the economy, politics. How different is this region from what it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago?
Well, it's
You've got 3 minutes.
3 minutes, right.
Or
like
less.
my colleagues, I will limit myself. The oral history program in recent years has been looking at the impact of the civil rights movement on the South and at both the profound changes that the civil rights movement has brought about in the lives of ordinary people and also the limits of the civil rights movement. And the changes are obvious: the end of legal segregation, of discrimination, and the unleashing of the economy. You wouldn't be seeing what you see around you at Charlotte if it hadn't been for the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement helped white Southerners as much as it did black Southerners. But there are also limits to what the civil rights movement achieved, and one of the key aspects of that is that, and it has to do with what I think is a kind of misunderstanding of what the civil rights movement was about, because economic issues, economic justice, issues of poverty were at the very core of the civil rights movement. It was not just about legal segregation. And those goals have not been realized. And I would say another aspect of the civil rights movement that I think is misunderstood is the kind of distinction in people's minds between the good civil rights movement, which succeeded, and the bad war on poverty, which failed. These two efforts were totally intermingled. They had the exact same protagonists. The people that had been fighting segregation were the people who were fighting poverty. The segregationists who had been visiting violence and other kinds of retribution on the civil rights activists were also fighting the war on poverty. And the war on poverty had a lot of successes, which it hasn't gotten credit for. And I think the fact that we don't remember all of that has helped to feed a kind of disillusionment with the hope that government efforts can actually make a difference in the economy and in poverty. Another limitation has to do with the kind of lingering racial resentments and stereotypes on the part of white Southerners. And I think I'm maybe actually more optimistic than some of the people on the panel, in the sense that I think that those racial attitudes have changed profoundly. I think, you know, we don't realize how much we've changed unless you go back and actually look at what the kind of virulent racism that preceded the Civil Rights Movement. And the degree to which those resentments and stereotypes linger, I think, is not just because of the legacy of slavery and segregation, not just because they've been there all along and it's going to take a long time to get rid of them, although that's certainly powerful, but because of things that have deliberate policies, deliberate propaganda that has intensified and stirred up and renewed those feelings. And they have to do with political strategy. The Southern strategy, which has been alluded to and kind of broadly conceived, how is the Republican Party going to win over the South? Well, part of that strategy had to do with demonizing the policies that came out of the Civil Rights Movement and were meant to realize the gains of the Civil Rights Movement. Affirmative action, for example, was one of the kind of wedge issues that was used to bring white workers into the Republican Party by creating the belief that this is a zero-sum game, and if you open up opportunities to blacks and women, white working men will lose. The attack on busing, which was aimed mainly at white suburbanites who would disavow overt racism, but who very much believed in the kind of homeowners' rights and who were very much blind to the way in which what one scholar has called affirmative action for whites, which was in place from the New Deal into the Civil Rights Movement, had created these kind of white enclaves, these neighborhoods that wanted and needed now neighborhood schools, and then, of course, the welfare queen. And this is still there. This is still behind the, it's all coded now. But this identification of welfare with African Americans and the notion that these are people who are getting something for nothing, these are people who are lazy, these are people, this is very, very powerful, and it's helped not only to perpetuate these racial stereotypes, but it helps, again, to discredit efforts to create and maintain a strong safety net. And then another thing I want to mention, both in terms of successes that people don't notice and the limits to what the Civil Rights Movement has been able to do, has to do with school desegregation. In the 1980s, the South had the most integrated schools in the country. That had to do with federal oversight, but it was also had to do with, take Charlotte as an example. Swan v. Mecklenburg, 1971, a landmark case which did what you have to do if you're going to integrate the schools. It said that you cannot have all-white suburbs and integrated inner cities. It has to be a metropolitan plan. You have to have two-way busing because of entrenched residential segregation, which is there because of public policies in the past. And that was a hard-fought battle, but it was embraced by an interracial coalition, which included white, blue-collar workers, and it became a tremendous point of pride for this city. And that is now being completely reversed because of the decisions of the conservative Supreme Court, which has made it impossible to create those metropolitan integration plans. So that now the schools of Charlotte are resegregating. The schools throughout the South are resegregating. In sum, I would say, so what are the limits? What are the challenge? These lingering stereotypes, and along with the rise of, in the South, of modern forms of segregation. I think the convergence that we're seeing is that Southern, I agree with Ferrel completely that the growth of metropolitan populations is good for the Democratic Party. It's where our hope lies. But the most segregated cities in the country right now are all north of the Mason-Dixon line. And they all have to do with de facto segregation. And that is the kind of segregation that we're going to have in the metropolitan cities of the new South. And then, of course, there's the entrenchment of rural poverty and the continued association between race and class, which I know that Jean can talk about better than I can.
Great. Thank you very much, Jacquelyn. So Jacquelyn, you did mention poverty. In fact, at one point you said the war on poverty had a lot of successes in the South. So I'm going to turn to you, Jean Nichol, who is a distinguished law professor and and head of the Center on Poverty, Work, and Opportunity. There hasn't been a lot of talk in this campaign about poverty, but there's been a lot of talk about jobs and about unemployment in the South. Expand on what we just heard from Jacquelyn. What role does poverty play in the political landscape? And if you want to, talk about how poverty plays off against the middle class and how the middle class is such a factor in this campaign.
Judy, I will do my best to do that. Let me say, too, it's great to see you all here, to be part of this panel. This being the South, I should note that this panel was to begin at 11:30 on Sunday morning, which is proof positive that journalists are heathens. The only programs we believe in on Sunday morning at 11:30 come out of the pulpit. Now, I'm a lawyer, so I'm an admitted heathen of long standing. It's nice to have your company. I would say, too, that like Peter, I do a lot of programs with Hodding and Ferrel, which means that I never expected to speak this morning. So you'll have to forgive me for a meandering presentation. I'm to talk about poverty in the United States, but more pointedly, poverty in the South. One of my favorite writers is Wallace Stegner, who writes not about the South but the West. Stegner characterizes the West as the native home of hope. And I think he means it in the good sense and the bad sense, too, sort of the Big Rock Candy Mountain notion. I always thought you could borrow a bit from Stegner and characterize the South as the native home of poverty in the United States, which means that we have more poor people and more political leaders who are untroubled by it than the rest of the country. So I think neither of those are a high compliment. You know the broad numbers about poverty generally, though as Judy said, we never hear these discussed in political campaigns. Some discussion of the middle class, so a lot of discussion of the wealthy, but almost nothing with those at the bottom. But in the United States, over 15% of us live in poverty, some 47 millions. The highest raw numbers likely in our history, and the highest percentage in over 20 years. The figures are worse by race, with Black, Latino, and Native Americans closer to 30% living in poverty. It's worse by age. Kids, the youngest, the most vulnerable, the poorest, over 22% in the country, over 25% of our kids in North Carolina live in poverty. And then if you cut that again according to race, in North Carolina, it seems to me a sort of badge of humiliation, 40% of our children of color live in poverty. Numbers that are tough to mention in polite company and out loud. Numbers which almost indicate a failure of a commonwealth. The South, though, is worse. The figures are worse. The economic circumstances worse than the rest of the country. If you look at it by region, according to the census data, about 17% of the South lives in poverty, and the other three regions would be between 12 and 15%. Uninsured, over 19% of us in the South are uninsured. The rest of the country ranges from 12 to 17%. There was new data released on this front last week, which is not in your materials. It indicated that Florida now has over 25% uninsured. I didn't hear that mentioned in Tampa. There was a lot of discussion about how bad the Affordable Care Act was, but no discussion of a quarter of Floridians having no health care coverage. The states with the highest poverty rate in the United States, 8 of the 10 are southern states, all but Virginia in the South. All of the southern states are above the national average, some way above, with states like Mississippi having over 30% living in poverty. 10 states with child poverty over 25%, 9 of those are in the South. There are 6 million kids living in extreme poverty. That means income of less than half the federal poverty standard. And of those 6 million, 42% come from the South. There are 11 states with over 10% of their children living in extreme poverty, and 10 of those 11 are in the South. The Pew study, a new one, Scott, relatively new, I think, on economic mobility, indicated that the lowest economic mobility in the United States is in Louisiana, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Alabama, Florida, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Texas. So this picture is pervasive. And the South, it's not getting better at the moment. The South is was the only section of the country in the last census where these poverty figures got significantly worse. Next point, being congenial to policies concerned with poverty. This is not a Southern attribute. I think we've seen that recently, a moment. States refusing to accept stimulus money, for example, some more heavily loaded in the South. We did sort of an odd look at the support and opposition to the Affordable Care Act. Very dominantly, those states with the highest level of uninsured expressed the greatest opposition to the Affordable Care Act, and almost vice versa in an outcome which would surprise Madison. The states having the most to benefit frequently expressing the greatest opposition, and similar arguments when it comes to Medicaid expansion. Great opposition so far in Texas, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Georgia. Alabama, where apparently there would be a 53% reduction in the uninsured under the Medicaid expansions. Texas, 49.9%, and yet a vehement opposition. So we could debate why this is so. Why would it be that we have the most poor people and the politics which is most deadly opposed to doing things about it? That has been debated in the South for the last 100 years at least. Why is it that the South treats poor people the way it does? Different theories from W.J. Cash and B.O. Key and Bob Dylan, sort of only a pawn in the game. I'm not going to try and answer that definitively. A lot of people here know much more than I do about it, including Ferrel and Hodding and Jackie. But I think maybe we could say this, or just say, first of all, the South has in common with the rest of the country the invisibility of poverty, the removal of poverty from our political agenda, the removal of the concern of the bottom 30% sort of across the board. So if that's true in the United States generally, it is certainly true in the South. I think we have in the South the what's the matter with Kansas phenomenon, which is some version of social conservatives joining with economic conservatives, even if they end up not really getting their part of the bargain, but voting against the economic interest of those at the bottom. And then Jackie has opened the door and sort of carried for me the harder news, which is that whatever else reaction to poverty is even more racialized in the South than it is in the rest of the country. That becomes more visible all the time. Well, we just saw a political convention last week, which was sort of remarkable on this front in its rhetoric and in its outlook. I'm going to end with this, but I kept having in my mind Stephen Colbert sort of coming to the front of the Republican convention and going, "Hail, white people!" And it was kind of an astonishing look, even from the aesthetics of our polarization. So I think there could be great argument about why we have reached the stage that we have, but we do seem to have more poor folks in the South and a less powerful commitment to do something about it than much of the rest of the nation.
Okay, so provocative comments from 5 folks in a row. And I'm going to warn all of you, I'm coming to you next as soon as we hear from our final panelist. I'm coming to you for questions, so we're going to get right to that. Jesse White, you ran the Appalachian Regional Commission for many years. You looked at the rural areas in the South. I guess was it Scott who called them the non-core counties, or maybe it was Ferrel, I can't remember. Here we are in the banking capital of the world in Charlotte. Are there 2 Souths, the urban, well-to-do South, and then the South that we just heard Gene Nichol describe?
I think that's a pretty good summary of where the South has come. And I think the comment I would like to leave you with is that the South is no longer either Mayberry RFD or the booming Sun Belt. It's a lot more complicated than that. The images that the American people have been left with of the South, neither one really obtained. What you've seen in Southern economic development for the last 50 or 60 years, you've heard about today, the convergence of the relative per capita income. The South was about 50% of the U.S. average in the Great Depression. We got up to about 90% 20 years ago. We've seen the urbanization, the metropolitanization of the South's economy. We've seen successes in technology development. A lot of good things that have changed the face of the South, but what these recessions have revealed over the last 30 years are the tremendous impact of globalization and technology. And it has ripped the covers off of the bed of the Southern economy and really has revealed 2 Souths, Judy, like you were talking about. If you look at the investment patterns of public dollars in the South for the last 50 or 60 years, we have invested very well compared to other states in post-secondary education. We've invested incredibly poorly in elementary and secondary education until recently, and it's created this bifurcated workforce. The top half of us are globally competitive with anybody. The bottom third has been left behind. And as we moved away from an economy based on cost advantages in mass production, which was tied to this branch plant recruitment strategy of economic development, and these jobs have started disappearing, it's left this bottom third high and dry. There's also been a tremendous spatial impact. I mean, we actually still have more distress in urban areas by numbers, but in terms of percentages and in terms of outlook and in terms of prospect, the rural areas are really have been left behind. I guess I won't take but another second just to conclude that in an election that is supposed to be all about the economy, as a southern white person from the same state as Hodding, you'll notice a lot, you'll run across a lot of Mississippians because we don't live there anymore. We've got a cabal working to take over Carolina. There are several of us there. But it's always astonished me how my, excuse me, fellow white Southerners almost consistently vote against the economic interest of the region from which they come. I mean, especially since Reagan, the broad policy of the Republican Party has been to reduce income taxes, which helps the South less because we have lower incomes, and reduce spending on social and economic programs, which hurts the South more because we have more at-risk people and more people left behind. And time again, white Southerners seem to be shooting their own toes off. I've never really quite understood it, except for these other factors we've talked about, which race, guns, gays, you know, the social and cultural currents that are affecting voting behavior. So it'll be interesting to see how, if Southerners return to voting their economic interest, I wouldn't hold my breath. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. All right, I see the clock is ticking. We've got 12 minutes, and so it's up to you. I'm going to turn it over. Who has a question? This gentleman right here.
Thank you. Charlotte, North Carolina, Democratic National Convention. Stratagem or missed opportunity?
What was the first option?
Yeah, what's...
Was it a brilliant strategic move? Is it going to help carry North Carolina or not?
I didn't know if we had to be recognized before speaking. It was a great idea at the time, for sure. Right? I sort of hit on the point earlier, and I'll be quick about this. Racial coalition building was actually quite significant in this state. And, you know, still in the state legislature, there are people who can appeal to folks in a racially mixed constituency. And that's true, I should mention, both for whites who traditionally have done that in the South, but also for African Americans. I think for a variety of reasons, some of them dealing with external factors. The economy not doing especially well has not been good for white working class voters, which is one part of that coalition. But also, again, given all these different changes that are, if they are effective, likely to limit African American voter turnout, that too could be a real threat to the Democratic Party. But I think the extent to which one thinks in the long term, right, there have to be inroads in the South. One thing we didn't talk about, population's moving southward and westward. So if you're really going to be competitive over the long term, you got to have an imprint here. Even if you're not going to win all of the South, you got to be competitive in some places. So whether or not in this election it's effective, I leave to others to discuss. But I think, at least as an initial decision, it wasn't a dumb one.
Hodding, do you want to add a thought to that? Or?
No. No, I mean, it goes on at some length, and I won't.
All right. Another question. Yes, sir, right here.
We've talked about race, voting, taxes, poverty, education. We've not talked about the deficit. How do you, would you comment on that in the context of the South and North Carolina?
Peter, do you want to jump on that first?
I think we had a pretty good solution in some ways to an initial approach to the deficit problem, coming in part from one of our native sons, the Bowles-Simpson plan. I think it's been lost in some ways. I think by January 1st, 2013, some version of that will come back regardless of who gets elected. I think the bigger problem right now, and I think what you'll hear next week is that it's too soon really to worry right now about the deficit. Bond rates, interest rates are so low right now. The economy is still in a very precarious position. And so I think at least in Charlotte next week, there will be higher priority economic issues than the deficit, at least over the next 6 months.
Right, can I add to, I mean, for someone like me anyway, we do have an economic deficit which is challenging and powerful. We also have a priorities deficit, it seems to me. A country doesn't have to come to the conclusion, for example, that it's going to tax capital gains at half the rate that you're going to tax much of the income of the rest of the workforce. Doesn't have to decide that we're going to have a great and powerful housing project in the United States. That is the mortgage deduction. It's just that maybe 80% of it's going to go to those making over $100,000 a year. Our state legislature doesn't have to, as they did just a few weeks ago, cut $350-something million to wealthier corporations as they decide to cut in half the allocation to food banks, given everything that's going on in North Carolina. So we do have an economic deficit, but I think we have a sort of moral deficit as well.
Ray, it's amazing to me that we have managed in the process of our life together to take off the table from any kind of intelligent conversation whatsoever a military budget which has no relationship whatsoever to what faces us as an international threat. That we are paying on our military side as though we faced 5 Russias simultaneously in those Soviet Union days, and need to keep raising that budget, Democrat and Republican. Now, look, if the wise men of the Simpson-Bowles Commission or the Bowles-Simpson Commission really were serious about what they were doing, as opposed to taking 3 from Category A and 3 from Category B, they would have done something very, very serious, not the get their attention by letting this damn budget be sort of slashed arbitrarily, but actually have done something heavily on the question of military spending. Not that that's any more the solution than taxing people like you and me will pay everything out either. But it is part of the solution about which I don't see how you have a solution without. And it's funny. Except, of course, we live in North Carolina, we live in Virginia, and we live in Florida. And you know what else lives in North Carolina and Virginia and Florida? The biggest allocation of federal spending that God could help for in bases and the location of servicemen, who are the great pump priming example that Southerners love and pretend is not federal pump priming. I mean, anyway.
We don't get a lot of the actually military construction. I mean, it's mostly base money, I think.
We already paid it out, boy.
I think our defense budget is more than the next 17 countries combined, something like that.
Maybe 40.
Question. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask the panelists, how long can we continue to go down this path that you have all described? without addressing a single one of the issues that confront us today? How long can we continue down this path?
I woke up one day and I said to myself, why is it that in a set of circumstances which in other places and other times would have had people out marching, would have people out at levels of protest which would be hair-raising, we don't have any of it? That somehow we are at a stage of acceptance, resignation, passivity, intimidation. No, I don't think intimidation. But there's something out there that we're drinking. And I'll be honest with you, because I despise much of the medium except the one that my dear friend is working with, one of the things you've got, which you never had in society before, was an ability to flip a switch and quit thinking about anything except the entertainment in front of you. You don't sit there plotting too many damn revolutions while you're sitting there. I mean, and I'm a horrible movie watcher, okay, so I mean, I know how it is. But we got a lot of stuff that we are able to do, which is escapist stuff, which will take you out of it. I honestly, you know, being a Mississippian, when I think to myself, Judy ran a thing on Terry Sanford 6 years ago, 5 years ago up here, and it was a great thing about him. But the thing about Terry, which so got us who were elsewhere, was he went right to the heart and said, look, let's talk about education. Let's talk about something that actually affects everybody. Who the hell is talking about something that actually affects everybody? And you ask the question how long that can go on. I honestly, I do not know. I don't understand it, but y'all are all smart. Why is it, big boy? You're the man that brings them out into the streets. Why? Huh?
I guess the question is, what comes next?
Yes, sir. I know. I know.
Who wants to tackle that? Yes, right here.
Thank you. I'm characterize the lens of gender, of women, white Southern women,
Black
women
Southern
of
women.
color from the South. Are there differences based on data, based on, oral history reports of women's perspectives on life here compared to other regions of the country? Love to hear something about it.
Jacquelyn, do you want to weigh in? And if either Scott or Ferrel have some data they want to throw in as well.
Yeah, I was really struck that...
Why'd you pick Jack?
I was raising my hand. I was struck that in the beginning when we were talking about even the polling data, gender didn't come up at all. We didn't hear anything about abortion and so on. But this is a really complicated question, and I just would say two things about it. One is that, and again, this comes from the work that the Oral History Program is doing. We are now focusing on documenting the women's movement in the South. And contrary to assumptions that there wasn't a women's movement in the past, there was and there is, and there's been a very powerful one, which needs to be understood and seen more clearly. But it is also true that, to my mind, and this hasn't come up, one of the biggest things that Obama has going for him is the gender gap. This is so important. I mean, without the gender, and women have been, there's been a gender gap for I don't know how many of the last elections in which women went for, including women in the South, went for Bill Clinton in much larger proportions than white men, white men I'm talking about. However, the gender gap has been narrowing in the South. So that in 2008, I think the gender gap in the South, unlike anywhere else, almost closed. I don't think there was any difference between white men and white women in the voting in 2008. 2012, I don't know. In North Carolina, I know that the polls are showing that there still is a gender gap with white women going for Obama more than white men, but the gap is not as great in the rest of the country. When you look at women of color, then that changes completely, and the gender gap opens back up again. So I think that one of the big challenges that the Democrats have and the progressive forces have is to address themselves to women in the South and to open that gender gap back up.
All right, I'm told by the bosses here that we are going to wrap up. It is just after 2 o'clock. I want to thank everyone for coming, but let's all thank these extraordinary panelists for their presentation. And thank Ferrel Guillory over there and Scott Keeter with their hands up. But we especially thank all of you. Susan, do you want to come up and say a quick hello?
You have a job to do? You watch Judy all week. You want to make sure that she's done a fantastic job, and I want to just say personally thank you.
Thank you.